I had been the sole Earth representative at Kelvan Deep Station for 19 years when the Compact decided to take it from us. They did not storm the place. They did not cut the power, or jam the relay frequencies, or send armed envoys through the access corridor. That was not how the theocratic mercantile compact operated. They had lawyers. They had doctrine. They had, above all, a breathtaking confidence in the weight of their own paperwork. In 40 years of operation, they had settled 14 territorial disputes, absorbed 3 smaller regulatory bodies, and expanded their jurisdictional reach across 11 stellar regions without once resorting to anything so crude as a threat. What they sent was a filing notice. Formal, stamped in 3 languages, one of which was theirs, one of which was the Compact's official administrative Esperanto, and one of which was a version of Standard that had been machine translated badly enough that the word for immediately had become, with celestial haste. I read it twice. Then I set it on my desk next to my cooling tea and sat with it for a moment. The notice informed me that under the Compact's naming doctrine, specifically the doctrine of derivate sovereignty, Article 9, Paragraph 2, any installation physically located within a named stellar region whose naming registration was held by a Compact member took on the sovereign character of that membership. Kelvan Deep Station, the notice explained, sat at the edge of the Aravan Reach. The Aravan Reach had been named in a registration filed 40 years prior by the Compact's own founding mercantile houses, as a ceremonial gesture at their first convocation. Therefore, the station was Compact property. They were prepared to be generous about transition. I had 30 standard days. I had been at this posting long enough to know what 30 standard days meant. It meant they expected no argument. I set the notice aside and pulled out the ledger. Not a digital ledger, the original, paper-bound, with a spine that cracked when I opened it, because I had not opened it in years. It did not need opening. The information inside it did not change. I had simply kept it because it was the kind of thing that should be kept, the same way you keep the deed to your house in a fireproof box, even though you have lived in that house for 2 decades, and it has never once occurred to you that anyone might claim it was theirs. I booked a session with the Compact's regional adjudication chamber for the following week. They were gracious about it. The scheduling clerk confirmed the time with a warmth that told me the Compact considered this matter settled in all but ceremony. There would be a brief formal session. I would acknowledge the transfer. Terms would be discussed. Transition assistance could be arranged for the posting handover. The clerk used the word comfortable twice without apparent irony. They assumed I was coming to negotiate terms. The chamber was the kind of room built to impress people who had never been in a room like it before. High vaulted ceiling with ambient devotional light in pale gold, curved benches of dark composite arranged in descending tiers. The presiding arbiter elevated at a dais faced in polished ceremonial stone. 7 assessors flanked her, robed in the Compact's colors. There was a gallery. It was lightly attended. Trade clerks, a pair of junior doctrinal observers, one bored-looking journalist from a Compact newswire who had probably been told this would be quick. They had the filing notice projected on the chamber's main display. Article 9, Paragraph 2, highlighted in amber. The naming doctrine. All very orderly. The presiding arbiter read me the substance of the claim, asked if I had any questions before the formal acknowledgement of transfer was entered into the record. I said I had a document I would like to enter first. She paused. That pause, a small tightening around her eyes, a slight adjustment of posture, told me she had not expected that sentence. They never do. 30 standard days. Generous terms. They had assumed the shape of this session before it began, and I had just put something unexpected on the table. I placed the ledger in front of the chamber clerk and asked that the founding registration of Kelvan Deep Station be read into the open record. It took the clerk 4 minutes to locate the relevant page and read it into the transcript. The chamber was quiet while she did. The presiding arbiter sat very still, in the way that people sit still when they are working through something in their heads that they do not yet want visible on their face. The founding registration of Kelvan Deep Station had been filed 42 years ago, 2 years before the Compact's first convocation, 2 years before the ceremonial naming of the Aravan Reach, filed with the Interstellar Physical Registration Authority under Article 1 of the Deep Space Charter, Category, Permanent Human Installation, Sovereign Character, Earth Mission, classification, relay and survey, coordinates locked and confirmed. Earth had named the station before the compact had named anything. There was a longer silence after the clerk finished reading, longer than was comfortable. The journalist had stopped looking bored. One of the assessors leaned toward the presiding arbiter and said something I was not meant to hear. She did not respond to it. She was reading something on the display beside her, the compact's own founding instrument, I realized. She had pulled it up herself. I knew what she had found, because I had read it 17 years ago when I first took this posting. Page 4 of the compact's founding instrument, entered to settle a jurisdictional dispute with the Solvari Commercial League at the time of the compact's formation. Any naming doctrine claim filed by a compact member shall be automatically subordinate to a prior physical installation registration held by any non-compact sovereign, where that registration predates the naming doctrine filing by more than one standard year. The compact's founders had written that clause themselves. They had needed it to keep 3 rival bodies from challenging their own naming claims at the moment of their founding. It had served them well for 40 years. It had never, in 40 years, been used against them. It was being read into this chamber's permanent record right now, because the arbiter had pulled it up herself and read it aloud to confirm what she was seeing. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The founding instrument was the compact's own document. The physical registration was Earth's. The math was not complicated. The arbiter sat with it for a moment longer. Then she said, very carefully, that she would need to recess the session for further review. I told her I understood completely, and that I would be available whenever she was ready to resume. She looked at me then, not the look of someone who had been outmaneuvered and was angry about it, the look of someone who had just realized this session had been over before it began, and was working out exactly how long ago that had been. I collected the ledger and walked out. The session notes were entered into the compact's permanent record that afternoon, all of them, the founding registration, the founding instrument clause, the arbiter's reading of both. Under compact procedural law, anything read into open session by a presiding officer becomes binding record on all parties within the chamber's jurisdiction at the moment of reading. The compact's own naming doctrine, invoked to take the station, had activated the subordination clause. The subordination clause had confirmed Earth's sovereign title. The arbiter had read both into the permanent record herself. It would take them 3 weeks to work out the full implications. I know because they sent me a follow-up notice at the end of that 3rd week. No ceremonial stamps this time, no celestial haste, no 3-language formatting, just a single paragraph acknowledging that the filing had been reviewed, that the registration predated the claim, and that the compact's doctrine of derivate sovereignty did not apply in this instance. The language was careful in the way that language is careful when a body of lawyers has spent considerable time choosing every word to admit as little as possible, while admitting everything that is required. No apology. I had not expected one. I made a cup of tea, sat down at my desk, and went back to work. 19 years at this posting. 19 years of maintenance logs, signal routing reports, routine relay calibrations, quarterly filings nobody in the compact had ever bothered to read. 19 years of doing the job because the job needed doing, and because someone had to be here to do it. The compact had sent a notice assuming I would fold in 30 days. I had sent a ledger. The station was still ours. The station had always been ours. The only new thing, the only thing that had actually changed in that chamber, was that the compact now had it in their own permanent record too. They would not send another notice.